Hey everybody, welcome to an episode of App Innovation Community. Today we're going to be taking a look at a modern authorization application that's using React MSAL and Azure Active Directory. What's interesting about this particular sample is what we're going to do is we're going to authenticate and get the user identity before the application actually loads. So when you're calling your child components and whatnot, you'll already have the identity. This is very similar to what we have on-prem. So when you're doing a cloud migration, a lot of times your applications already expect to have that user identity established. And so that's what this application sample is actually going to do. We're going to build an app from scratch that actually authenticates against Azure Active Directory, gets that user identity, and then is able to do callbacks to your backend APIs and so forth with identity. So let's go take a look. Okay, for the first part of this, I'm actually going to refer you guys to the Federal App Innovation Community GitHub repo. In that repo, this whole example is there. You can clone it and actually set the client and the tenant ID, and it'll just work. And we're going to probably borrow some of the code from this and actually walk through the samples out there. It'll just be easier, and it's already there. So first off, if you go to the site, and the link will be down in the chat, there's an example for modern auth. That's our topic. And then we have an area for the React MSAL AAD sample. So if you go in there, I put all the different steps actually in text. So if you want to follow along without, watching the video, that's fine. This video, we're going to actually walk through these exact steps. So if you look at the README here, we broke this into two different parts. So step one is going to be setting up Azure Active Directory. And so you're going to have access to actually build app registrations, which we'll walk through the whole process here in the next video. And then part two is going to be actually creating the application. So this is when we're actually going to use npm, create the application, set a couple items in there, and then the app will operate. So let's go do that process now. Okay, so for the quick walkthrough of the repository here, the top part one is setting up Azure Active Directory, and we're going to go through that here in the next video. But what I want to do in this clip is actually walk through the repository so you get a feel for where things are. The setup is actually relatively easy. This is the modern application, the modern version of MSAL. So you basically we're using MSAL React and MSAL browser. And there's one file we need to create basically called this Auth TSX, which gives us our settings. We specify the settings in that piece of code, and the redirects actually happen. Walking through the code a little bit, there's the interesting piece about this example is once again the fact that we go through and authenticate before the app loads. So we want to make sure, like most of these React examples actually have non-authenticated and an authenticated area, zones as what they're called. That's what happens as your app loads and maybe a user's browsing like a non-authenticated page and they click an authenticated link, and then that's when you assure the user authenticated. Because we're kind of talking about on-prem potentially to cloud migration, you're going to want to make sure the user is authenticated before your app loads. Most of those applications, like an old IIS app or what have you, is expecting that user to be authenticated well before the app actually loads. So you have identity, you have something to go query to get user profile information from, those kind of things. The other thing that's nice about this is in fact modern auth. Most of your cloud migrations, some of the challenges are in fact making sure your application's authenticated and make sure you're using modern auth. And it gives you more options, and it's going to be less expensive for you. So instead of moving like a bunch of VMs to the cloud, you might be able to use a PaaS service, something a little less expensive perhaps because you are abiding by the modern auth stuff. But anyways, in this repo, what's kind of interesting to show some of the key points. If we go into the source, this is a regular old React app. Some of the big pieces are, so first we go to the auth folder, and we're going to create this in our sample. But the auth config, this is the one that's the default right out of the MSAL examples. Basically, all you need is this section, and then you just fill out this export area here. It's basically a set of properties that gives you the client ID and the authority, which is effectively your tenant and where the app should authenticate. Then, of course, you got to specify the redirect URL. I'm not going to exactly go through the whole authentication process. There's tons of videos out there, but in a nutshell, your application loads. It looks to see if you've been authenticated before with the token. If not, it goes and redirects, in this case, out to your AAD tenant. It allows you to log in, and if your login successful, it redirects you, as this is a redirect, back to your application that's specified here. Your application then grabs those tokens and determines your ID based on what's written in that token. And I'm not going to go very deep into that, but that's the nutshell. So it's app loads, gets redirected, it comes back, and then you have identity. But once again, a lot of these examples are based on applications that might have a non-authenticated front end. In this application, we want to make sure you're authenticated. So the first thing we're going to do when we build our application is set this MSAL config. Going back to the source folder, as we build this application, once again, you can clone this and just set those tokens and the app will run. But some of the important pieces we want to do are right here in our index TSX. So when your application loads, and once again, this is a a brand new application, what React creates when you create a new application. Basically, we're going to want to use this thing called an MSAL provider. And so this wraps your application here. So when you create the application, which we're going to do in a second, without this, it's just going to be your strict mode with the application and nothing wrapped around it. So we're going to go ahead and create an instance here. And then we're going to do the MSAL provider here to make sure your application's wrapped with that MSAL provider. So we're going to modify this file once we create the new application. And then lastly, to make sure, once again, this is a unique kind of app because we want to make sure we have identity right when the application loads. And I'll explain this a little bit more when we actually build the application. We're going to actually render our actual function app a little differently than what it does by default. The main highlight here is making sure we use this MSAL authentication function here. And then what I've been doing, which seems to work pretty well, is creating this hook here that actually stores the user ID. And then down in the actual function here, as you're rendering your application, what you do is you basically have one line of code here that emits a generic app that basically is calling this render function that just sits there and keeps trying and trying and trying to get the user identity. And then once the username is actually set, the application can actually load, and then it basically will show you the identity. So that's the two magic pieces, really. Once again, we want to assure that the application has identity before the actual app renders, so we can then call child components. So like in here, in this part of the function, you would then start calling your child components, and then you very well can say like user ID equals, and then pass this user ID. In this case, we're using the email address as our identity. You could actually get the OID to use as your primary key, as it were, for the user. In this case, we're using the email address. And so once again, you can then pass that to all your child components, and then identity is already rendered and already established. So it makes it really easy to then render. So, all right, so let's go ahead and start building our app. All right, here we go. So part one is effectively establishing your Azure Active Directory part. So once again, the application loads, the MSAL library is going to check to see if you have a local token already. If not, it's going to reach out to Azure Active Directory to try to get that token. And so what we're going to do is go into our Azure tenant, go to Active Directory, and then down here, you're looking for app registrations right here. Now, once again, you're going to have the correct access to do this piece of it, but you click on app registrations, click on new registration, and they've made this a lot easier these days. So it used to be that you had to put a lot of different scopes and things. A lot of that stuff's defaulted now. So this should be super simple. So I'm going to say app 2. In this example, we're going to leave it in a single tenant mode. In the instructions, once again, I'm actually following these steps in the example. So once again, you can navigate to AAD. I'm just following these exact steps. Select app registrations, click new, create unique name. So I called my app, app 2. Actually, I'm going to put animal app 2, just to make sure it's unique. Your tenant obviously will be a lot less than this one, so you could probably get away with the actual app name. Here we have the organization. I'll just leave this default. Down here, we're going to select single page application. Now this is for this particular example, we're using localhost and we're using the React default. So once again, if I go back out to the sample, I think it's like 3000 or something. Let me go back here. If I go to my source and then auth config. And once again, we're just presetting this stuff up. React by default wants to use this 3000 port address. So I'm going to copy that with the leading /. I'll leave all this alone and make sure it's good. And that's basically it. So click register, give that a second. And if our app name is unique and so forth, it'll come to this screen. Now we're going to need to remember this stuff here. Mainly the application, our client ID. So this guy and then the directory tenant, those are the two main tokens. So we're going to have the authority effectively is the URL it wants to redirect to for authentication, and then it's going to be your tenant ID, so it knows who to authenticate against, and then your application ID effectively is the client, which one to use. So just keep this screen up for now. We're going to need it in the next clip. All right, in this clip, we're actually going to build the React app from scratch. And so we're going to use npm, npx. We're going to use some the React MSAL browser and so forth. We're going to bring those dependencies in. We're going to build the app absolutely from scratch. The caveat here is, so as of today, this is basically your standard npm git install, and it should pretty much always work the same with whatever version you have going forward. So I'm not going to publish the exact version I'm using right now because it'll probably should work the same from this point forward. So first, if you look in part 2, creating the app, we're going to follow these instructions here. So step 1 is using the npx utility to actually create the app. So go to our trusty command line and go back to our working directory, and I'm just going to run that guy, and I'm going to call it, I believe my application, I called it, this doesn't really matter, but to keep them kind of synchronized, I'm going to call this application Danimal App 2 to kind of keep it in scope with my AAD. So, and once again, so we're going to do, create React app, the name of our application. And I want to definitely highlight the fact I'm using TypeScript. It actually makes all your React programming a lot easier, a lot more, human readable. And a lot of our React examples out there are just in JS. This is all going to be in TypeScript. So hopefully this helps. So I'm going to create that guy, and I'll probably cut the video here because this takes a little while to build, because let's bring all the dependencies down. So I'm going to pause the video and come back after that's complete. Okay, it is done, and it says happy hacking. So this is always good to see. Yay. All right. So here what I always like to do, so first we're going to have to change directory to our app, which I believe is C success. I'm just going to go here. Directory, and let's go. First I like to open up VS Code first, take a look at what we got in here. So once again, this is our just generic app. Like I said earlier in the video, if you look right here, it just used, the default, React mode here. So this is just your basic app. There's nothing here yet. So let's go ahead and run that guy. Sometimes as soon as I build an app, I always like to npm start, and let's take a look at what we got first. Okay, so here's our application. You see this is the just default React screen you always get when you build a brand new React app. Okay, so next, going back to our instructions here, we're going to want to install MSAL React and MSAL browser. So I'll just go grab those guys, go back to our app, terminate that for now, and actually I always like to close this to make sure we're good. We'll go install those dudes. Okay, that took a little while. The installation was successful. So now let's go back to our app. The first thing I like to do is create a new folder for Auth. You get in the habit of actually making folders for everything in your React app. It just keeps things like your components folder, keeps everything very organized, because usually, some people just put everything in the main folder. It gets kind of unruly really quick. So we're going to do first, once again, let's go back to the App Innovation community. I create a folder for Auth, and then we're going to create a new file name, authconfig tsx. So let's do that. And in there, once again, I'm just copying these things right out of the repo, just easier. This is the actual MSAL example from Microsoft. And so, there's no modifications here. The only thing we have to specify is the client ID and authority here. All this is just boilerplate stuff. I actually, in my example, I left, the default localhost in here. In your production application, you're gonna have to put your actual URL for your real, whatever your DNS is for the actual application. So let's go back to here. Actually, let's go back to our example. So we are on step here. We added, Yep. Okay. So we create our auth config, and now we're setting the variables up from the previous step. So the root element is this, Microsoft, in this case, Microsoft login. And so if you see our example here for the authority, we need to craft that URL, which is this URL plus the GUID of your tenant. And then we need the client ID, which are both, specified after we created that app registration. So let's go back here and I'll paste that in first. Get rid of that generic placeholder. We're going to want the tenant ID for that one. So once again, the pieces that we're going to need out of the screen are going to be the tenant ID and the client ID. So first I'm doing the tenant ID. So we grab the tenant ID and we go back to here. And I think, so that looks pretty good. Let me go back to the example just to make sure there's no ending. So once again, the first piece we got to craft is this, the authority. Right. Once again, this is where it redirects to, and you need your tenant ID there. The next piece is the client ID. So let's go grab that guy. So application ID or client ID. Once again, this is the screen you see after the app registration was successful. Go here, and I'll put that there. Save that file. Okay. So right now we created the auth folder, we created the auth config TSX. The auth config TSX by default is what MSAL, we're going to tell it to look for that when we create the instance of the authentication library. And so it's just easier to keep all your constants here. And then also, once again, it has some other things in here of interest, especially when you do multiple callbacks to get, graph scope and so forth. In this case, we're doing a basic authentication. So the first step of this is setting these properties right here, which we just did. Okay, so next, let's go back out to the example. Once again, to show it's pretty straightforward here. We're following these examples here. We're just done with step 5. So now we need to work on step 6, which is the index.tsx changes. So once again, what's happening here is we need to add this const here, which is the MSAL instance, and we're passing that MSAL config. And then we're going to go ahead and wrap our application here with the actual MSAL provider instance. And that code's already here. I'm actually going to duplicate this tab real quick to make it easy to go back. So I go to my source and I just look at, and once again, this is the same code, basically just from when you create a brand new React app, this is what you kind of get. So it's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this const and go back to our application and go back to index. And just dump it right above the root is fine. And actually we can go ahead and I'll go and grab the imports. You can automatically import those, but just for brevity, I'm gonna go ahead and paste them in. Then we're gonna go ahead and wrap our app with this instance. Your app might already have some other wrappers and things in there, but this is already in there. So that's gonna be an issue here. Let's get everything building here. Let me just double check to make sure all the packages got installed, and yep, we got the 2 here. So we should be good. Okay, yeah, so I was missing a reference here for MSAL browser. So it checked it for me. So let me make sure the app renders. Okay, it's still running the script. So let's let that sit for a second. So basically, I bring in the public client application with the MSAL config, which is that thing we put in the auth, which is all of our settings. And then you wrap your application here with the MSAL provider. And that's all we need to do in index.tsx. And so once again, this is the main app that loads when the application's ready. Let's give this a second to render. Actually, as that's rendering, we're going to go back and just start making our app changes. Okay, actually it comes up here now. So this should just give us still a generic React app screen. Yeah. So now we've wrapped the application as it loads with this MSAL provider, right? So there's some other elements that we can actually use to kind of force authentication at this point. Now the infrastructure is in place to actually support authentication. So what some customers are doing, and as I mentioned earlier in the video, is you might have a screen that's non-authenticated that you want like a hello, to your app, or maybe a splash screen or whatnot. So this is what's happening now, is there's nothing telling the environment to authenticate yet. So what we're trying to do is we want the authentication to happen before the child components are called, to make sure we have that identity just as you would on-prem, like with an IIS server or so forth. We want to make sure that authentication happens immediately. So that's what we're going to do now, is we're going to go to our actual application, and we want to force authentication right out of the gate. And how we're going to do that, once again, going back to our steps, which is step 7, the app changes. The key here is this step here, which is use MSAL authentication. So when the application actually gets invoked, we're going to go ahead and do a redirect. So we're using this piece here called interaction type. We're going to say redirect. There's also a pop-up, which will do like an iframe pop-up inside your application. I prefer doing a redirect because you can actually see the trace in the URL, and it's easier to debug, and you fully redirect to your company's single sign-on page, and it feels more like you have more control and you see what's happening to the application versus a pop-up. It's easier to trace. So we need to add that, and then we need to add this constant hook here, which allows us to kind of set the user state, as it were. So we're using a hook to actually track that string to make sure that the user's identity is established, which is what this is doing right through here. We want to make sure that we keep trying to authenticate and get that user identity from the tokens that get passed back to us before the rest of the app is called. Okay, confusing, might be a lot of steps, but it'll make sense once you deploy it. So let's get into that part of it now. So once again, going back to the repo, I'm gonna go ahead and grab these 2 import statements, and then we just dump them at the top. We're gonna need those. Immediately, so as soon as you add this piece of code to your application, it's going to go ahead and try to call back to Azure in this case to do authentication. We want to use a hook to track the identity, right? So this allows us to use the state, and I'll bring import in. So bring import React. We import the hook for that, the use state hook, and then so all these applications need to return some HTML. So I'm gonna go ahead and just grab this function here first. Put that at the top. And so now we have a method that's using a try-catch block to just constantly, and it might redirect a few times and back and forth trying to get the identity, that it just tries to set that state. So if the state is not set, we want to go ahead and say, please wait. And if the state is set, we want to render the app. And that's what this code's doing here. So this application has to return something. That's what this return's expecting. So React wants this component, function component, needs to return some kind of HTML. And so what I'm saying in this piece of code is if the user is not established, then we want to keep calling render to try to update the model behind the scenes and just say, please wait. And if the identity is not empty, meaning that's been set, then we want to go ahead and render what the user is. So I'm just going to grab this block of code here, and I'm going to replace the current return, which is this guy here. Let me see if this is right. All lined up. Now, if I save this, what's going to happen, we should see, and maybe I'll minimize this and go back to our React app. What we're going to see is the app's going to say, please wait briefly. It's going to redirect to our Azure site. Let me move this over some, and it's going to give us the prompt to trust the application, right? So with that in place, let's save it and see what happens. So you see the please wait, and now it went over to our Azure Active Directory. And so in this case, remember our application was called Danimal2 in this case. It's asking for permission to actually provide authentication for that application. It only does this like once. So once you say accept, you're not going to see the screen again. So I'm going to say accept, and if everything works, we should see our user identity. But if you watch closely, you should see it flicker a little bit. Okay, please wait. Okay, so you saw it for a second. I went back, and I'll explain the code in a second. It went back. MSAL library was able to take that token that was passed to it and extract the user ID from it. So now, we effectively have our user ID that was returned from the AAD call. So quickly, and so that's pretty much it. So once again, your application now is ready to go. So in this line of code here, from this point forward, your application now has this identity, this MSTR user, that you can pass the child components to properties, or you can render it. And so you have identity before your application effectively loads. Okay, so that's all good, perfect. And now explain a little further, some other things we might want to do is actually at this point right here, if this is successful, then you have this username that you can then call, if you want to do an effect and call back to an API to get some kind of load statement. What I usually do is actually create a bunch of subcomponents that actually have that use effect and then pass the user ID here back as a property. And so then in those subcomponents, you can then call your APIs with that identity. If you need to look up some kind of profile information or whatnot, it will go and have the identity. You can call all the child components and you have that already established right away. Okay, so yeah, that was it. So basically, once again, just a quick recap. If you follow these steps and set up the whole thing in AAD, your end result should be like we saw here with your user identity in the very beginning. So I hope that helps. Hope that's useful. You can always put some comments, and you can always create GitHub issues if you have any problems. And that was it. Thank you very much.